There is a civilization that gave the world its alphabet, and then vanished so completely that it left almost no record of itself written in its own voice. Every letter you have ever read, in English, in Spanish, in Arabic, in Greek, in Hebrew, traces its shape back to marks carved by Phoenician traders on clay and stone somewhere along the coast of what is today Lebanon. The entire written history of the Western world flows through that single origin point. And yet the Phoenicians themselves, the people who created that system and sailed it across the known world, left behind almost no literature, no history, no account of who they were or where they came from. Everything we know about them was written by their trading partners, their rivals, their enemies. The Greeks described them as cunning. The Romans described them as treacherous. The Israelites described them as neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes a source of dangerous foreign gods. But the Phoenicians never described themselves at all. For generations, historians worked with what they had. The Phoenicians were Canaanites, the standard account held, a Semitic-speaking people native to the Levantine coast, who sometime around 100 BCE, as the Bronze Age collapsed, and the great palace civilizations around them disintegrated, found their footing in the wreckage and turned the chaos into an opportunity. The collapse of the Bronze Age was one of the most catastrophic events in ancient history. The Hittite Empire disappeared almost overnight. Mycenaean Greece went dark. Egypt survived but barely. The trade networks that had stitched together the eastern Mediterranean for centuries shattered, and into that vacuum, the cities of the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Berytus, stepped forward. They built city-states that operated less as a unified nation than as a loose confederation of maritime trading hubs, each one a specialist in a different commodity: purple dye from Tyre, timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, glass and metalwork from workshops that exported their products as far east as Mesopotamia and as far west as the Atlantic coast of Spain. They established colonies across the Mediterranean, in Cyprus, in Sicily, in Sardinia, in Spain, and most dramatically in North Africa, where Carthage eventually grew from a modest trading post into an empire powerful enough to field armies that crossed the Alps and brought the Roman Republic to the edge of destruction. The Phoenicians, in this telling, were a coherent ethnic and cultural group who simply happened to scatter widely. Their identity traveled with them wherever they sailed. It was a clean and confident narrative. It was also, as the genetics would eventually complicate, less than the full picture. The first disruption came not from DNA, but from archaeology. When researchers began examining the colonial sites the Phoenicians established across the Mediterranean with more precision, they found something that didn't fit the simple diaspora model. The populations at these sites were not transplanted Levantines who maintained their origin culture in foreign soil. They were mixed from the very beginning. Local peoples at every colonial site appear in the archaeological record, alongside the incoming traders, not as subjects or as a conquered underclass, but as participants, intermarried, integrated, contributing their own ceramic traditions and burial customs and agricultural knowledge to what was supposedly a Phoenician settlement. The pottery tells the story most clearly. At site after site, archaeologists find Phoenician-style storage jars and trade goods sitting in the same stratigraphic layer as locally produced ceramics that had nothing to do with the Levant. The buildings are Phoenician in their religious architecture and their orientation. But the everyday material culture, the cooking vessels, the grinding stones, the agricultural tools, belongs to whoever was already living in that landscape before the Phoenician ships arrived. Carthage itself, founded according to ancient tradition by a Tyrian princess named Alyssa, who fled a dynastic crisis at home and purchased land on the North African coast from a local Berber king, showed genetic and cultural signatures from its earliest recoverable layers that were not purely Levantine. The colony was a synthesis from the moment of its founding, and the local Berber populations who negotiated with its founders left their mark on the city from the very beginning. But it was the ancient DNA work, beginning in earnest in the late 2010s and accelerating through 2020, that forced the real reckoning. A landmark study published in 2020 by a team of researchers at the Wellcome Sanger Institute and collaborating institutions extracted and analyzed ancient genomes from individuals buried at Phoenician and Punic sites across the Mediterranean, including specimens from Lebanon itself, from Sardinia, from Ibiza, and from sites in Tunisia near ancient Carthage. The goal was to trace the genetic thread that connected these far-flung communities back to their supposed Levantine origin. The results confirmed part of the story and fundamentally complicated the rest. The Lebanese specimens, drawn from individuals buried at coastal Phoenician sites during the Iron Age, did show the Levantine ancestry profile that historians had always assumed. These were, in their deepest genetic roots, a Canaanite population with ancestry tracing back to the Bronze Age Levant, itself a product of ancient mixing between early farming populations from the region and hunter-gatherer groups, whose specific identity researchers are still working to clarify. That foundational layer was real, but when the researchers turned to the colonial specimens, the individuals buried at Punic sites across the Western Mediterranean, the pattern fractured. The colonial populations were not genetically uniform extensions of a Levantine founding group. They were, from their earliest recoverable layers, already blended. Sardinian Punic individuals carried significant ancestry from local Bronze Age Sardinian populations. Spanish specimens showed contributions from indigenous Iberian groups. North African specimens were more complex still, showing a mixture of Levantine North African, and in some cases Southern European ancestry, that spoke not to a clean transplantation of Phoenician identity, but to something more fluid and more interesting. What the DNA was describing was not a diaspora in the conventional sense, a coherent population scattering from a homeland and maintaining its genetic identity across distance. It was describing something closer to a cultural network, a set of shared practices, shared gods, shared trade goods, and shared writing systems that moved across populations of genuinely different genetic origins and bound them together under a common identity that was defined not by blood, but by participation. To understand why this matters, you have to sit with what it means that the Phoenicians spread the alphabet to people who were not Phoenicians. The Greeks who adopted Phoenician script and transformed it into their own alphabet were not the same people as the Phoenicians. The Semitic-speaking peoples of North Africa, who built Carthage into a Mediterranean superpower, were not a simple extension of the Tyrian population that had nominally founded the city. The Sardinians who buried their dead according to Punic religious rites while maintaining their own genetic distinctiveness were not Phoenicians by origin. They were Phoenicians by choice, by trade, by the adoption of a cultural package that crossed genetic boundaries, because the package itself was worth adopting. This is the twist that changes everything. The Phoenicians were not primarily a people. They were primarily a system. A system of exchange so efficient and so attractive that populations across the entire Mediterranean basin opted into it regardless of their ancestry, and in doing so became functionally Phoenician, even as they remained, genetically, themselves. The city of Carthage is where this becomes most dramatic and most consequential. By the time Carthage challenged Rome for Mediterranean dominance in the Punic Wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the city had been drawing population from the Western Mediterranean for 4 centuries. Its inhabitants traced their ancestry not just to Tyre but to every port and every farming community that had ever done business with Punic traders. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, who came closer to destroying Rome than any commander before or after him, whose tactical genius at Cannae still appears in military academies today, carried in his genome not simply the heritage of a Tyrian princess who had sailed west in search of a new home. He carried the accumulated genetic history of a city that had spent 4 centuries becoming something genuinely new. Not Phoenician in the narrow Levantine sense, not African in any simple sense, something that existed only in the specific place where those streams had merged. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, burning the city and salting the earth according to later tradition, It did not simply defeat an enemy. It erased one of the most extraordinary experiments in synthetic identity that the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. A city that had proven, over 4 centuries, that cultural belonging could be constructed, maintained, and passed down across generations without requiring a shared biological origin. The DNA preserved in those Sardinian and Tunisian tombs is the evidence that experiment actually worked, and what it tells us now reaches beyond the ancient world entirely. Because the question the Phoenician data raises is not really a question about the past. It is a question about what identity actually is. Every modern nation, every ethnic group, every religious community that defines itself by a common ancestry is telling a story about itself that genetics inevitably complicate. The Phoenicians are simply an unusually clear and unusually well-documented example of a pattern that repeats everywhere you look closely enough. The Irish are not simply Celts. The English are not simply Anglo-Saxons. The Arabs are not a single genetic population. The Jews of the ancient Levant and the Jews of medieval Europe carry overlapping, but distinct ancestries, shaped by centuries of movement and contact that no simple origin story can contain. Cultural identity and genetic identity have always been separate things, traveling sometimes together and sometimes apart, binding people across biological differences and separating people who share common ancestors. The Phoenicians did not invent this condition of human existence. They simply demonstrated it more vividly than almost any other people in the ancient world. The alphabet the Phoenicians gave the world carries no DNA. It carries only the sound of a human voice, reduced to marks on a surface, reproducible by anyone who learns the system regardless of where they came from. That was the Phoenician innovation, not a bloodline, a technology. A means of transmission that crossed every boundary that bloodlines create. And it outlasted every empire that ever tried to claim it as its own. The Phoenicians were never simply what the history books described. They were never simply a Levantine people who sailed west and planted colonies of themselves across the Mediterranean world. They were the architects of a system so powerful that it made the question of who was really Phoenician permanently unanswerable. And the DNA is now showing us that they knew something, perhaps without knowing they knew it, that we are still struggling to accept, that the most durable things human beings ever create are never made of flesh. They are made of ideas that anyone can carry, in any body, across any sea.